Thank you, and thanks for inviting me here to talk about something that I don't get a chance to talk about to normal people. So you have to understand, I've been working with campaign finance data for the better part of 18 years now, and it is usually when I do get to talk about it, I get to talk about it to people who are also living in that universe. I'm not going to overload you on that, but please understand it's a small joy for me just to even sort of talk to normal civilians about it. So, of the APIs that the New York Times has, we have about a dozen or so public APIs. There are a couple things you should know. One is that by far we are the largest consumer of our own APIs. We built most of them for ourselves, frankly, and then opened them up because we thought other people might find them useful, and for a lot of other good reasons. The Campaign Finance API is not the most popular API we have. I know you'll be shocked to hear that, but there is a limited number of people who are interested in campaign finance data. But those who are interested in it are really interested in it. And so from a perspective of serving a niche audience, it makes a lot of sense for us to do this because we're interested in it. It's public data. It's not stuff that we own or necessarily even create. It's public data, and it speaks towards our mission of public service and informing the public. So the Campaign Finance API is 4 years old. And this is my daughter Caroline. She was 4 years old when we took this picture. And I chose it because, much like Caroline in this picture, we sort of didn't really know exactly what would happen the first time we strapped a helmet on her and put her on a scooter and sent her out in the world. The Campaign Finance API, when we first created it, we thought, well, people will use it for what we think we're interested in. And back in 2008, that was largely what we thought people were interested in, were searching for people who gave money to presidential candidates. And that's not an inconsequential thing, but what we really thought was people are going to be focused on search. They're going to want to look up their neighbors. That's always fun. And they're going to want to be focused on the presidential race because it's such a huge deal. So we plan to do those things, and we also plan to have it on a reasonable timeline. Political committees at the federal level, and I said I won't go too far into this, but they file with the Federal Election Commission. They file information about people who give them money and how they spend it. And the Federal Election Commission updates its data in bulk every Monday morning. And so we thought, perfect, we'll do that too. We'll store the data, we'll update it every week, and that way it's not going to become sort of a big chore for us. And it's a regular schedule that people who use the data are already aware of. Well, and people won't really care a lot about stuff beyond the presidential race or really nitty-gritty stuff. And we were wrong, I was wrong, about every one of those things. Nobody uses search anymore. I mean, at least not our API endpoint, because there are much better services on the internet that do individual contributor searches. And that's a hard lesson to learn sometimes when you think, oh, well, everything we do must be, marvelous or good. Well, okay, but there are other very, very good and talented people out there who do very, very good and talented things. And sometimes you should sort of just live with that. But more to the point, we found that the people who did use the API wanted more of it. And so even though the FEC updates its data in bulk every Monday morning, filings come into the FEC on a daily basis, on a constant basis. You can file anytime you want. And so Monday was such a it was a deadline, and there were several thousand filings that came in on a Monday, but filings keep coming in every day. And so we update now every 15 minutes based on what was recently filed to the FEC. And yes, I have an iPhone app that I built that shows me who's filed in the last 15 minutes, and my, again, niche audience. But I kind of like it. So we use our API to help us build interactives for the New York Times. And that's a fairly common thing. You want to use the stuff that you build to make your job easier and better. And we do that, and the API helps in a couple different ways. One is that it helps us not to have to worry about doing things on a web app basis and on a mobile app basis and on an iPhone, an iPad, and Android basis, but just sort of on a single basis of here comes some data, and then what we do with it, that we can sometimes have to distinguish or differentiate. But for the most part, it helps us to do things that look and feel the same, whether you're seeing them, whatever device you're seeing them on. But the other thing that we use the API for is we use it for reporting. And I mean reporting in the sense of what the New York Times does. We use it as a sort of a river of data, to borrow the phrase that Dave Weiner coined. That river of data, and we see it go by, and we have little sort of triggers, events that happen that we can see in the API that a reporter might be interested in. So, for example, if a filing comes in and it's an amended filing, in other words, it replaces a previous filing, well, the API will tell me that, like, hey, something changed between this last filing and the original filing that came in maybe weeks or months or years ago. And sometimes what changes is newsworthy. And so it'll kind of help us along in that regard. It'll sort of point out or suggest things that might be noteworthy. And that's a big help to our reporters because, again, when thousands of filings come in, you don't have time to look at all of them. You don't have time to even look at half of them. You basically just are lucky to even catch a little bit of the river. But other people use the API in really, really kind of fascinating and somewhat humbling ways that we didn't really expect. Now, like I said, the API is 4 years old, so when it was started, we didn't have these things called super PACs now. Most everybody's heard of a super PAC. If you haven't, basically it goes like this. If you have a lot of money and you would like to give it to a political committee that would then like to use it to either further enhance or destroy the career of someone running for Congress, you can do that now. It's not that you couldn't do it before, but now you get to have a committee like, Americans who love America, or, left-handed beekeepers for freedom, or whatever you want to do. It's fine. Honestly, you have a wireless connection. If you have a bank account right now, you could register a super PAC while I'm talking, and it would be approved by the time I'm done. So, don't do that, actually. But I mean, after I'm done, go ahead and do that. So, but this universe of super PACs, of committees that have sort of become a thing the last couple of years, has now, it's enabled, or actually made it more important that journalism organizations be able to describe this universe and who the players are in it. And so Mother Jones magazine contacted us a couple months ago saying, we really want to kind of do this. We want to define it as a universe, and literally, as if you went to the site, it's sort of like a space thing. It's a universe of gas giants and red giants and dwarves, and they did a really neat job with it. And it was something that we really couldn't have anticipated or even kind of done when the original API was released, but it's something that made sense to do. And since we had all the data in real time, it's an easy enough thing to do. Now, ProPublica, which is a nonprofit investigative journalism outfit here in New York, had a similar desire. They wanted to find out who was funding these super PACs. And at the time that they wanted to do this, we actually didn't have a particular endpoint in the API that said, okay, well, show me who the top donors to a certain committee are. You might think that's sort of an obvious thing to have, but at the time we didn't have it, and we were in the midst of the Republican primary season, and so we were kind of busy. And so when Al Shaw at ProPublica contacted me and said, hey, we really want to do this, and we really want to use your API because we already use it for some other stuff, do you think you could kind of make this happen? And I said originally, well, without cloning, probably not. But and then it occurred to me, well, actually, you could make it happen. And Al said, well, I don't really understand. Like, how does that work? And I said, well, look, this is public data. And this isn't going to work for everybody, for your organization necessarily, but this is public data. We didn't have anything to hide here. So Al got a commit keys to our repository for the API. And Al actually built the feature that he needed and put it into the API. And we released it that way. And I have to tell you, that was awesome on so many levels, but mostly because it saved me a lot of work. But it was awesome because I saw up close what a user really wanted because he actually wrote out what he really wanted. And it was the kind of feedback that is, is hard to get in other ways. And so seeing that, we really made a big difference. And so we released a new version of the API with this kind of information. And now, if people want to do it, if people have come to us with ideas and they're developers themselves, we say, look, let's figure out a way that we can work on this together to make this a better API for you guys. And that is, like I said, it's a really good way to get closer to your users. The Texas Tribune is another nonprofit investigative reporting outfit in Austin. And while the New York Times is a nice big global news organization, we don't cover, for example, every Texas congressional race. We don't really have the wherewithal to do it. But the Texas Tribune cares about that sort of stuff. And so our API enables them to look at that, isolate, focus on Texas races. But we get the benefit of that as well, because if they build something using our API that highlights something that is interesting, from data that we probably would not have looked at anyway, well, now it kind of can point us in the direction of where to look. And I think you've probably heard this a couple of times today, but you can't really predict how people will use your APIs, but what you can learn from how they do use them. And not just the behavior of how they use them, but what they actually end up surfacing. And this is a kind of a sea change for us as an organization, because the New York Times is, I guess the best way to describe it is Timesian. I mean, it's this thing, it's this cultural object, it has this identity, it's this heft, this weight. And so as a result, we're not always the sort of folks who will just take any story idea off the street or have people sort of suggest, hey, you should do this. Yes, I'm sure we should do this, but we've been in this business for however long, and we think we know what we. Honestly, opening up this API has given us more ideas about reporting on and how to cover campaign finance because of what people are interested or what they look at. It has shown us that our story generating process, our ideas generating process is, I think, excellent, but it's not broad enough. It can't include all these other people. And so now we can actually get some of that back into our own processes, our own story generation, our own ideas that can really yield some better stuff for us. So, we have some, the obligatory, somewhat cropped traffic stats. Like I said, the campaign finance API is not the most trafficked API that we have by a long shot. But when events that are important to it, like an election, occur, that traffic escalates pretty dramatically and in a hurry, especially if there are significant dates around it, filing deadlines and things like that. So you have to be ready for that. You have to be able to run, because your users are going to run ahead of you, and that's a good thing, but you have to be ready for it. Originally, I thought that we should write a lot of API wrappers. And so I spent some time doing one. We released a Ruby library, we released a Python wrapper for it. But I noticed that every time we did this, I ended up writing a slimmer wrapper each time. So I started out with one that would do a whole bunch of application stuff and convenience methods and things like that. Make it really, really easy and what I thought everybody would want to do. And by the time I had written a second or third library, it came down to, you know what, just give them the object to work with, because I don't want to do application logic for you, and you probably don't want me doing application logic for you. And so you can write API wrappers, and you probably should. But there's a line between writing a wrapper and doing application logic for somebody else. Let your users give them the stuff and trust them to do good things with it. The last one isn't particularly API specific, but I do see this with government agencies that are kind of going into APIs. And that is they'll release data, and it's a good thing, but they will often release data sort of in a way that makes it very difficult to use without context, without some sort of depth to it. The FEC data is great, but it also is based on people filing forms to the FEC, and people make mistakes. And so where it's obvious that they've made mistakes, we clean it up a little bit for them. Because we don't want to have things like misleading numbers based on the fact that somebody had a typo in their filing. So if you're working with public data, or frankly, if the data itself, whatever you're working with, is important to you, then you need to spend some time with it and make it good data. And simply having the API isn't good enough. It's the data that counts, and the quality of the data is what's going to make your API. I mean, that's as important, I would argue, as the design and the availability of the API is the quality of the data that it serves. And so for public data in particular, people who are working with public data, it's a messy thing. And so I think we have every obligation when using public data and redistributing it to do what we can to make it cleaner, simpler, easier to use and understand. Because not everybody is a campaign finance geek like me, nor should they be, both for my job security and your sanity. Probably in that order. But if you want to become one, even for just a little piece of time, a little moment, it shouldn't be hard for you. And you shouldn't have to learn all the things that I've learned over 15 or 16 years of doing this. So, with that, thank you very much.
Have a seat. So there's a tall order here. We stand in between these people at a well-stocked bar.
And believe me, a journalist knows how important that is.
So I will be brief, but I want to ask you, coming from the news business, was there any concern that competitors could use this data, like those nice people at USA Today, for example?
Sure. There was originally. And the way that we kind of got around that was by saying depicting the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is that someone gets a really good story using our API.
Yeah.
And the worst, and again, as part of that worst case scenario, they have to cite us in the second graph of their story. And you tell that to virtually any editor, and they'd be like, that's not too bad. I can live with that, I think.
Right.
I mean, the other side of that is if it was that good of a story, we should have had it. So, like, the fact that someone else did it isn't, like, we didn't make, they would have done it, probably would have done it anyway. Somebody would have gotten it anyway.
You've enabled it, but you weren't probably the spark.
If it was that good, we should have had it. And again, worst case scenario, they got to credit us anyway. And we'll take that.
I love this idea that the API and how outsiders are using it are informing your story generation.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Can you talk more about that?
Sure.
Maybe give examples.
Yeah, I think the sort of visceral example is that I get notes frequently from our campaign finance reporters and political reporters, and they'll send me a link to something that someone has done and be like, this is awesome. And I'll say, yeah, they did it with our information. And then at first they said, again, it's a jolt to them. They're kind of taken aback a little bit sometimes. But on the other hand, it'll say, as a journalist, I think, we have this weird sort of construct where, like, if someone else does something really good, the rest of us are forced to ignore it. I mean, like, acknowledge it and then ignore it. And say, like, or say, like, well, we can't do that. We can't go near that, like it's radioactive, or it's been done, and everybody only gets to write one story on a single topic in, like, I don't know, some undefined
The previous
time
editor
span.
of Forbes used to cite articles done in the 70s.
Right. So
this was 5 years ago.
Right. So I mean, I think it's kind of opened them up to we can do this better, or there's something in this that we can refine. And I think it's a very freeing thing for a lot of reporters, because they're used to sort of, if somebody takes a shot at a story and they do it pretty well, it used to be, well, we can't go there because it's pretty good, and are we really going to beat it? Mm-hmm. And I think knowing that we're actually sort of supplying the data out there that enables this sort of stuff, I think for whatever reason, I think it is a factor in this change that I've seen over the last couple of years, which is that they think, you know what, let's go back to this and let's take a really good shot at it and let's see if we can do it better. Whether it's a motivational factor or something that's cultural in it, how the news business has changed, I don't know. All I know is that it's not as much of a sort of a stigma as it has been. And I think like our reporters are starting to understand now that there are many possible ways to tell, they can get several shots at it.
Right. So you describe yourself as a campaign finance geek, and I believe you.
Yes.
From these 15 years of looking at campaign finance and election outcomes, what is your prediction for this presidential election? It might end up on Twitter.
Yeah, luckily, I was going to say, I'm going to disappoint folks because luckily the New York Times prevents us from doing predictive stuff. Although my colleague Nate Silver has quite a history of predictive things.
It doesn't have to be right.
That's
the
also,
nature of the prediction business.
That's still the problem. I think I won't give you a this or that candidate. I will say this, that of the previous elections, presidential elections that I've covered, this one seems closest in sort of temperament and competitiveness and scope to 2004. Now, I'm not guaranteeing it's going to come out the same way, but this election reminds me of 2004.
In what way?
In that it's sort of, we have basically like a small crop of really horribly afflicted people in, say, Ohio, who are being fought over as if it's the Western Front in 1917.
Oh, it's stunning, yeah.
And it's trench warfare, and they're fighting over the same people, and it's this inches and ground war and a slog, and it is a very, sort of, elections almost never get style points, but this is not a style point election. This is a 15-round heavyweight. You just stand in the center of the ring and punch each other.
The feet on the ground are going to matter.
Well,
in those few turnover states.
It always does, and this is actually like, in sort of technical terms, like the way that you turn out voters has changed dramatically compared to the last couple elections. I mean, compared to 15 years ago, where virtually everyone experienced the same presidential campaign, even if you lived in a different state, we all saw the same ads pretty much. We all got the same mail. Well, that's all changed. I mean, like, what the fellow from Capital One was talking about, the segmentation, the personalization stuff. I mean, that's all gone to campaigns now, at least to national campaigns, where depending on where you live,
the message is tailored to what...
in ways that are just sort of, A, slightly creepy, but two, are completely flip the way that... It's a complete change in the way that large-scale campaigns are run. I mean, you literally have the equivalent of A/B testing in politics now on a live basis. And that is both fascinating, but it's also, again, a little scary in the sense that they don't really know exactly how that's going to come out. I mean, and there actually this has been going on for about 8 or so years now, this sort of A/B testing, experimental kind of stuff, and it's only going to trickle down to Senate races and House races and further down. I mean, the way that you can now tailor or construct the 50% plus one of an electorate that you need to reach and then focus solely on them is a lot different from the sort of 30,000 foot, we're going to carpet bomb the airwaves with ads and then hope that some number of people actually respond to that.
Is that driven by the web in the sense that you can segment audiences very nicely on the web? Or is it driven by the fact that there are, however many swing states versus 1960, there were 20 swing states?
I would argue it's actually driven by data and the web. I mean, the web makes sort of ubiquitous data more, fun, easy, doable. But it's driven by the fact that we all now have the discount thing for the supermarket on our keychains. It's driven by the customer rewards programs that everybody's have. It's driven by the fact that you can go and purchase, if you're a political campaign, the subscriber information from certain publications and then use that to tailor your messages. So it's a very different campaign, and the technology end of that is what makes that possible.
Fascinating.
So it's a lot of fun.
Well, thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.